everyone. Welcome to our Produce Safety webinar series. I'll start. Let me share my screen here so I can do the intro slides. Sorry. Can you see my screen okay? And can you hear me well? Yeah? Okay, great. Let me move this here. All right, so again, welcome to the Produce Safety webinar series. We have a speaker today. Our invited speaker is Donna Clements, and the title of the webinar is FSMA Produce Safety Rule Pre-Harvest Agricultural Water Requirements and Resources. So we began a monthly webinar series last year in August, and this series provides produce safety information beyond what is included in our Produce Safety Alliance grower training courses, and all the topics that we are offering during these webinars, they stem from frequent questions from growers that attended our PSA grower training courses. So these webinars, they are offered on the third Tuesday of each month, and we are always we'll be joined by a guest speaker. And as I mentioned today, we have Donna Clements from Cornell University. Donna has worked with Produce Safety Alliance since 2015, first as the Southwest Regional Extension Associate, and now as the PSA Coordinator and Northeast Regional Extension Associate. Donna's role with PSA is to coordinate projects, offer training courses on the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, and also she provides technical assistance to growers and produce safety educators, and also develop resources. Growing up on her family's produce farm, Donna has experience in produce production, harvest, post-harvest handling, and farmers market. Donna received her Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees, both in plant science, from the University of Maryland. We will have time for questions, so you can submit your questions in the Q&A box. And the topics for today's webinars. So this webinar will give you an overview of the revised pre-harvest agricultural water requirements, including the agricultural water assessment. The webinar will help growers determine if they are subject to the revised requirements. And Donna also will share resources to help you with implementation and also discuss scenarios. I just wanted to share our UC Small Farm Food Safety website. I can drop the link in the chat after Donna starts her presentation. So you can click here and you can find tons of resources, and you can also see the events that our team is offering. And also we have some training resources such as the PSA grower training that we offer every other week. So for webinar resources, as I mentioned, they will when we finish this webinar, we are going to post the recording, and all the recordings for all webinars, they are archived for on-demand access. So you can go to our website, you can see the PDF of the presentations, and you can also watch this webinar later. All right, so Donna, I'll stop my presentation and you can start yours. Let me know if...
Perfect. Give me just a moment.
Okay.
And to share. And you should see that in a moment. Excellent. I think you should see that.
Yes, yes.
Perfect. Thank you. And let me give me a moment. I'm going to pull up the participants in the chat box so I can kind of keep an eye on what's going on. Thank you, Thais, for inviting me today to give this presentation. I see a couple of familiar names in the chat box, which is always, or in the participant list, which is always really nice to see. So Yeah, it's exciting to be here. As Thais mentioned, I am Donna Clements with the Produce Safety Alliance. I lived in Riverside for about 8 years, Riverside, Moreno Valley. And when I was serving as the Southwest Regional Coordinator or Regional Extension Associate, I had the opportunity to work with Thais and Aaron, and a number of other folks and industry members in California. So it's really, really exciting to work with you again. Um, so I did drop a resource list in the chat box. Part of, I think, the reasoning for me coming on today was to talk about the updated or the revised Subpart E, so pre-harvest agricultural water requirements in the FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rule. But also probably more helpfully, include and introduce you to a number of resources. So that resource list contains, I think, just about all of the resources that I'll be talking about today. And so if I'll try to drop it a couple of more times throughout, but that is a good link to hold on to because it has a lot of information. So a couple of housekeeping items. If I tend to like to take questions throughout, so we will have time for question and answer at the end of the presentation. But if you have any questions or yeah, just questions or input or clarification you want, please feel free to raise your put questions in the chat box or yeah, in the chat box would be best. Excellent. So in terms of setting the stage for today, before we jump right into pre-harvest agricultural water, I wanted to back up a moment and sort of set the stage and provide some context for the pre-harvest ag water requirements that we're going to be discussing. And the first thing to consider is your farm or the growers that you work with covered by the Food Safety Modernization Act FSMA produce safety rule? Just to provide some context, the requirements we're going to be discussing today fall within that broader FSMA PSR regulation. So if your farm is not subject to the regulation, then you would also not be subject to these Subpart E or pre-harvest agricultural water requirements. I'm not going to spend a lot of time today going through what the exemptions and exclusions for the regulation are. However, I did look through the past webinars, and I think Thais did a great job of sort of setting up that entire stage of the regulation and for produce safety. So if you would like some more information on exemptions and exclusions to the rule, you can look for this FDA decision tree. That's included in that resource list, or you can also look at the recording for Dr. Don Steckel's webinar from September 16th, and he really walked through those exemptions and exclusions pretty thoroughly. The second piece of context I wanted to talk about was, are you using agricultural water? So we've talked about whether you are subject to the regulation or covered by the rule. The next thing we're going to talk through is, what is agricultural water, and are you using ag water on your farm? In the produce safety rule, FDA has a very specific definition of agricultural water, and we'll talk through that definition in a few slides. And then lastly, are you using specifically pre-harvest agricultural water? And there are some exemptions to these, some of these requirements that we're going to talk through in this presentation as well. Okay, so just to sort of explain a little bit why we are here, in May of 2024, FDA revised the requirements for Subpart E, specifically the requirements for pre-harvest agricultural water. And just to sort of broadly explain to you where the differences are between those initial pre-harvest ag water requirements that were published in 2016 versus those that were revised in 2024. The revised requirements really move from a strict test your water, look at what those numerical numbers are, and then make decisions on those water testing results. They're really moving away from that structure into more of a holistic or systems-based agricultural water assessment. So this is really a risk assessment looking at your entire your entire farm, specifically pre-harvest ag water, and making decisions essentially based on your risk assessment and what you're seeing on the farm. So it still remains that the expectation is that you as growers understand your water quality and how your management practices minimize risks to the crops that you grow. And the thing I really want to highlight here, and we're going to be talking about this, but as growers, it's really important to be able to explain what you're finding, sort of being able to explain what your agricultural system looks like and why you have made the decisions that you are, and being able to do that during those inspectional visits. And I do want to take a moment here, and I'm going to flip over to the attendees. Um, can you all raise your hand or put in the chat box? Is anybody here already familiar with the revised pre-harvest agricultural requirements? So you can use either the reactions button and sort of thumbs up or raise your hand if you have. I'm just curious. Okay, couple of people have. I'm going to pause for another moment. Okay, excellent. So it looks like a few people have given thumbs up. So a few people are familiar with these revisions. That's perfect. That's good to know. What I'm going to be doing is I am going to be walking through some of the basics, but then throughout this presentation, I'm going to be interspersing it with newer resources, frequently asked questions that we receive. So hopefully, even if you've seen some of these slides before, it's not too repetitive. The other thing I want to mention is one of my very last slides, I have a QR code that if anybody is interested in receiving a certificate of attendance for this webinar, and this is a Produce Safety Alliance free certificate of attendance, essentially to show that you have attended a webinar or an information session on the revised pre-harvest ag water assessments. I have a QR code with a very, very short little form that you can submit, and then you will receive that certificate by email. So just a heads up that you can expect that toward the end of the talk. Okay, so before we jump into the revised requirements, I want to highlight for you these compliance dates. And these are specifically for pre-harvest agricultural water. And these compliance dates for, again, pre-harvest agricultural water are tiered, much like the other compliance dates have been in the produce safety rule. And with the largest business size, those compliance dates went into effect last year, April 2025. Small businesses are sort of rolling up. This is $250,000 to $500,000 in total produce sales. Those are coming up in April 2026, and then very small businesses have another year and a few months to prepare to comply with these requirements. So for many businesses, they're not yet required to be in compliance. And we're really still in the sort of process of reaching out and providing this information to people. Okay, so I wanted to set the stage with some definitions that are really significant for this webinar. And the first definition is the meaning of agricultural water. So this definition has not changed from when the initial produce safety rule was published in 2016 to now, but it is a very specific definition to the rule, to the produce safety rule. So specifically, agricultural water is water used in covered activities on covered produce where water is intended to or likely to contact that produce or food contact surfaces. So again, it's specifically water that is intended to or probably going to come in contact with that covered produce or food contact surfaces. And that's really important when we talk about cleaning and sanitizing and things like that in post-harvest water. And then, of course, when I say covered produce, I don't mean that is which grown under a greenhouse or whatnot. Covered produce in the context of this requirement refers to the harvestable or harvested part of the crop. So again, this is water that's going to directly come in contact with covered produce. And again, just to sort of set the stage, I came up with a couple of hopefully California-specific examples, at least based on my experience working in the state. But looking at this, again, you can use your reactions, your thumbs up or or whatnot, is this considered agricultural water? So we're looking at lettuce crop. This is a picture from Salinas overhead irrigation. Would this be considered agricultural water? Yes. Nice job, Alex or Alexandra. Yeah, so I see a couple other thumbs up. This is going to, it's overhead irrigation. It's directly going to contact that lettuce. This would be considered agricultural water. A couple of other really quick examples we'll walk through. Oranges and pesticide application. This is going to be a foliar application. So we're driving through the ranch, foliar applying protective materials. Yes, this would be considered agricultural water. Whatever water is used up to mix up those pesticides probably is going to be coming into contact with those oranges as we see in the picture. Carrots and drip irrigation. So this would also be considered agricultural water because that water, they are root crops, but that water is going to be percolating through the soil, directly contact those carrots. Potatoes and overhead irrigation. What about this one? Agricultural water? I'll give you all another minute or moment. Okay, so this one, and you can feel free to use the chat boxes, or I didn't see any thumbs up. This one would not be considered, exactly, thanks, Billy. This one would not be considered agricultural water because potatoes are listed as a rarely consumed raw, so these are not covered by the produce safety rule. So even though this overhead irrigation is probably going to directly contact those tubers, those potatoes, they're not covered by the rule, so not considered agricultural water. And then a couple last examples, head lettuce and root on harvest. I don't know if there's any hydroponic or aquaponic folks in the audience, so I threw this one in. But in this example, it really depends on how it's harvested. In my experience, root on harvest, as you see in the picture, it's going to be carrying that water that it was used for growing. And once you package that in with that living lettuce style, so roots on, it's going to be in that enclosed plastic container. Chances are that water is going to come in contact with that lettuce head. So I would probably consider this agricultural water. But again, this usually is more of a it depends situation. And then the last example I wanted to give is avocados and packing line sanitation. This would be considered agricultural water. However, this is going to be considered post-harvest water. So I did want to mention it as an example, but this will be post-harvest water in a slightly different context than what we're going to be discussing today. Okay, so the reason I went through those examples is I really wanted to sort of set the stage for what is agricultural water, specifically in the context of the regulation. And now we're going to move into what are some of those revised requirements for pre-harvest agricultural water in the produce safety rule. So the first thing I wanted to start with is talking a little bit about an agricultural water systems inspection. For those of you who have previously attended the PSA grower training course, this slide may look familiar to you because this agricultural water systems inspection was a requirement way back when the rule was initially published in 2016. So this requirement has not changed. However, it is still a requirement and it actually ties now into the agricultural water assessment in those revised requirements. So I still wanted to start off by talking through what this looks like. So this water systems inspection is really a inspection of your water source and distribution system. So the idea here is that water can be contaminated at the source. It could be your pond, a well, a canal. We know that different water sources are going to be riskier than others. Surface water sources like canals are probably going to have some more contamination than a municipal water or a well water source. So this water systems inspection is looking through the source and distribution system. We do highly recommend mapping your water distribution system so you can sort of maintain and consider all of that distribution during your inspection. And the requirement here for this inspection is it must be done at least annually. And then the last requirement is keeping water sources free of debris, trash, domesticated animals, and other hazards. Um, and here we go. So the other thing I wanted to mention about this water systems inspection is this is a requirement for both pre-harvest agricultural water, like your irrigation water, your sprays, um, if you have frost protection, dust abatement, that any of that water that could possibly come in direct contact with covered produce. So it's a requirement for both pre-harvest agricultural water and post-harvest ag water. So if your operation has a well that you're really just using for cleaning and sanitizing food contact surfaces, you are still required to do an ag water systems inspection for that post-harvest water. And that's going to be one of the big differences between the agricultural water systems inspection and the ag water assessment. And we'll talk more about that in a couple of slides. So I wanted to talk through an example of what this agricultural water systems inspection requires. So in this example, we have an orange orchard, and they're using a canal to mix up different protective sprays or pesticide application. You can see in this picture, this is another example of foliar application. So in this example, I'm not sure if you can quite see, but or in this scenario, the oranges are still green, but there is harvestable crop there. So in this example, this would be considered agricultural water, right? This water directly contacts that harvestable crop. And a couple of examples of what this water systems inspection would include are, what is that water source? So in this example, it's a canal, it's a surface water source. What is that distribution system? In this specific example, we're looking at pulling in there's an intake and sort of a lateral, and we're pulling directly in from that canal just based on where this ranch is located. In terms of the farm's control and degree of protection, because we're pulling in from the canal and then that lateral, not very much ability to protect, right? It's all going to be open to the environment, not enclosed, so very limited control. What are those adjacent and nearby land uses? This is a very rural area. Um, a lot of ranches, a lot of citrus production, not very much animals. And then what are the likelihood that hazards may be introduced? So again, here are just some examples that you might consider when doing your agricultural water systems inspection. But again, very much the water system, and specifically, these are going to be risks that are under the farm's control. And I want to highlight here the next thing that I'm going to introduce, the next requirement, which is that of an agricultural water assessment. And this is a new requirement that FDA added in these revisions to the pre-harvest agricultural water requirements. So what is the difference between an agricultural water systems inspection and an agricultural water assessment? I will say, to my brain, these two terms sound almost synonymous with each other, right? I think if you were to ask me without knowing the definitions, what are the differences between, to me, these sound very, very similar. So in the next couple of slides, I want to highlight to you where an agricultural water assessment differs from this inspection. So again, these are two different things. For pre-harvest water, these will each require a record. And toward the end of this presentation, I'm going to explain to you, and I'm going to share a number of resources and highlight that we have templates available for both of these. So my recommendation as we walk through these requirements, or as we walk through this information, is listen to what the requirement is, and we're going to walk through an example and a scenario with these records to sort of help you fill out this information for your own operation. So again, the ag water systems inspection, we walked through that example. This is really the whole system, anything that is under your control. I mentioned that it applies to both pre-harvest and post-harvest water. Whereas this agricultural water assessment, this is only a requirement for pre-harvest ag water. So this would be the water that you're using for irrigation, pesticide application, heating protection, frost protection, evaporative cooling, things like that. And it is expected that the results of your water systems inspection will directly feed in to that ag water assessment. So the system is a big part of the ag water assessment. And I'll show you an example of what that looks like in a couple of slides. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions before I continue. And as I pause, I'm going to take another moment in case there's anybody new to drop in this resource list. And this resource list contains most of these resources that I'm going to be discussing today. Okay. So when we talk about the agricultural water assessment, this new requirement, the nuts and bolts are going to be these key requirements. So this ag water assessment is required to identify conditions that are likely to introduce hazards to covered produce or food contact surfaces. Um, you will see this term hazard being used over and over. I want to highlight that when it says conditions that are likely to introduce hazards, I like to think of these as risks. So you have your microbial hazards on the farm. This could be wildlife coming into the field. This could be, water. Maybe you have contaminated water from upstream, whatever your neighbors are putting into the canal. Those are all hazards. The risk that we're looking at is how likely is this hazard to be introduced into your operation. Um, so that's really what we're looking at here is what is that risk as of that water as it pertains to your produce and food contact surfaces. The agricultural water assessment must be done at the beginning of the growing season, at least annually. It must be reassessed whenever there's a significant change. And then it also has to be recorded, right? So this is going to be a new record keeping requirement. It must be written, reviewed, dated, and signed in a reasonable time by a supervisor or a responsible party. So when we talk about what is required in the ag water assessment, there are 5 different elements. The first one is that agricultural water system. Surprise, this is what we already talked about when we mentioned the agricultural water systems inspection. So if anybody here already has that written down in a template, that information can be fed right into this agricultural water assessment. And this would be location, nature of water source. How is that water being distributed? Is it in an open lateral? Is it an enclosed pipe through drip irrigation? It is in a municipal system. How protected is that? And then the remaining elements are how is that agricultural being used? How is it being applied to the crop? Is it overhead irrigation, drip irrigation? What are the crop characteristics? Environmental conditions, and then other factors. And this is where, if anybody's already doing water testing, this is sort of where that water testing piece fits in. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk through each of these elements. And again, if anybody has questions, feel free to drop any questions in the chat box. So I'm going to briefly go through and describe each of these elements in the agricultural water system. In the resource list that I shared with you, we have a copy of these slides. So if you, for example, are furiously taking notes or want to revisit this information in the future, I can share with you these slides in the future, but you can also find them in this resource list. So looking at the ag water system, this is what we already talked about with that systems inspection. So you can see here on the left, we have the location and nature of the source. And the way we've set this chart up is on the second column, we have more susceptible. So more risky or more open to contamination. For example, surface water sources compared to less susceptible, which is municipal water. We set these slides up the way we did to help give detail and examples when you are filling out these templates and these records for your own operation. So we're hoping to make it easier for you to conduct this agricultural water assessment and have these records prepared for your inspection. The second characteristic is type of distribution system. Again, more susceptible is going to be open canals, laterals. Less susceptible is going to be some kind of enclosed system. Degree of protection. So again, are these water sources used for, or is the water system used for other uses? On the East Coast, a lot of the farms that I've worked with that historically use ponds, those ponds are also used for recreation, paddleboarding, sometimes swimming, things like that. So that's going to be a little bit riskier compared to less susceptible, protected from animal access. Sometimes I see holding ponds are lined, right? So lines, so they're not going to have that contact with silt and other things that can grow pathogens. So that was the first element. The second one to talk through is how are you using these agricultural water on your farm? How are you applying that water? What is the time interval between applying that crop and harvesting? The idea here is the more contact this water has with the crop, potentially the higher risk it can be. And then the other thing is the closer that water is applied to the crop before harvest, the higher risk it can be. And for those of you who have attended the grower training course previously, you may recognize these slides. And I added these quick couple of slides just to highlight that the risk assessment has not changed. So even though these pre-harvest agricultural water requirements have changed, the risk assessment and the way we look at our water systems has not changed. So to highlight that, I wanted to talk you through a couple of very quick examples. So looking at this risk here and evaluating this water system and the practices, this water source, this surface water source, is being directly applied directly overhead to these tomatoes, bush type tomatoes, very close to harvest. In the chat box, do we think this is risky or less risky? So I should say higher risk or lower risk. You all are a quiet group today. Higher risk. Yeah, thank you. So, perfect. Yep. Okay. Perfect. Yes, higher risk because it's surface water, it's open to the environment, potential for contamination directly being applied to that crop close to harvest. So not much opportunity for die off of pathogens over time. And then what about this one? Just a second quick example. Surface water source being applied drip irrigation very close to harvest. Higher risk or lower risk than the previous example? Okay, so this one is going to be lower risk because, thank you, because it is applied with drip irrigation. So chances are we're intending for this water to have lower contact with the crop. Things happen, our drip irrigation gets cut or gets dug up by foxes or whatnot. But normally drip irrigation is going to have lower contact. And this same risk assessment process still applies, even though the infrastructure and the requirements in the rule have changed. So we've talked through two of the elements so far. We've talked through the water system and our practices. How are we using that water? The next element to talk through is crop characteristics and environmental conditions. So crop characteristics, I will say, this is, in my opinion, the area in the revised requirements where we need a lot more research to be done. We just need a lot more data. In this chart here, we still have crop characteristics, and we have a couple of examples of places where that risk might be higher because of adhesion, meaning the pathogen can stick to that crop. So if you think a crop like a rough texture, this could be a cantaloupe, right, with ridges. So think about a cantaloupe. There's lots of nooks and crannies and areas for that pathogen to be protected, be hidden, and to feed off of that sweet cantaloupe, on the stem scar, or feed off that cantaloupe, compared to places where this adhesion, internalization, and survival is less likely. So smoother surfaces, smaller surface area, things like that. There's fewer places for these pathogens to internalize and infiltrate. That said, there is more research that's starting to come around with crop characteristics, and we're learning that these environmental factors and these details are not always as obvious as we would expect. So in my opinion, this is somewhere that we're really expecting more research to come out in the next couple of years. So sort of a hold tight for more, and don't get too concerned in this in the crop care. We have so many other factors in this agricultural water system to consider. And then the last thing I want to mention here is environmental conditions. So considering these are both the environmental conditions, your normal growing conditions. So for example, in California, this could be Imperial Valley, where it's very dry, very warm, high amount of UV. We expect die-off to potentially occur more rapidly, or more die-off to occur than places like Central Valley or up north, where the climate is completely different. So again, environmental conditions, but this can also be those extreme conditions that are not our normal. So flooding events, this could be, more rain than normal, higher humidity, these sort of odd conditions that are not our norm. That's really what we want to pay attention to. Same with freezing events. If you're not normally expecting freezing, that's where those environmental conditions can come into play with this ag water assessment. Okay, and then the last element that I want to highlight is sort of other characteristics, including test results. So I'm going to say this a couple of times here, because this slide, I think this is the big change between our previous pre-harvest agricultural water requirements and now. Testing pre-harvest agricultural water is no longer a requirement in the produce safety rule. So it is no longer explicitly required. However, as somebody in education and extension, we cannot overstate that still taking water tests is extremely important, because in my opinion, this is one of the best ways that we know what our water quality is, the quantitative risk in our water. So I still recommend going ahead, taking water samples. Even if you have not taken a water sample, go ahead and get one done of your water sources. If anybody here is undergoing third-party audits, like Good Agricultural Practices audits, this could be Primus, Harmonized GAP, others, there's a good chance that those auditing requirements will require water testing. So please, if you're already testing your pre-harvest ag water, continue doing that for your third-party audit. But this is this place that water testing can be added into the agricultural water assessment. I also want to state that test results cannot be used as the only basis for making those decisions. So this is really sort of part of that whole holistic system. Okay, I'm going to pause and see if anybody has any questions. And excellent question. So Bilia, does the person, and I'm not sure, I think all of these comments are going just to hosts and panelists. I don't think anybody else can see these questions, but does the person sampling the water need to have annual training? Excellent question. So I'm going to restate again that there is no testing requirement for pre-harvest agricultural water. However, if the person is sampling, to my knowledge, they do not need to have annual training. So when we're talking about third-party audits, no longer the regulation, but third-party audits, there is often a requirement to use a certified lab, but no required training for the person sampling that water. It is important for that water or that person to read the instructions. So if you order water sampling kits, they will come with instructions. Often they'll have instructions like a wearing gloves. So you want to have aseptic technique. You want to make sure you're not contaminating that water sample. You're storing it properly, but no training is required. Alexandra asked, you mentioned there are templates for these assessments and inspections. Are they in the resource? Yes. Yes, they are. They're coming up. I have a QR code. I don't have them saved right here. So I can drop the link in when we get a little bit closer because I have them in my notes. But if you open up the earlier link I shared, I will share it again. The templates are in that list. There you go. Um, Okay, I think one of my lettuce shippers asked me for the person training for water sampling. I can look into that. There are occasionally buyer specific requirements, or even GAPS audits, but to my knowledge, attending a water sampling training is not a requirement for GAPS audits that I'm familiar with. Buyer requirements can be a different beast, but I can jot that down and look into it. I'm not aware of a specific training that's a requirement. I'm not sure if Thais or Aaron has heard of that. And I see Natalie's also one of the attendees. So I'm not sure if anybody else is aware of buyer specific requirements, but especially in terms of the regulation, that is not a requirement. Okay, great questions. Okay, so before we get too much further into the agricultural water assessment requirements, I want to highlight that there are 3 exemptions to this requirement to perform an agricultural water assessment. And the first one is farms are exempt from conducting this ag water assessment if the water is the same quality as harvest and post-harvest agricultural water. So if you are testing your water source, and normally this is going to be a well water, and that water is no detectable generic E. coli in 100 mils and meets the other post-harvest ag water testing requirements and is not untreated surface water, then that water source is exempt from this agricultural water assessment. So again, if it's a well and it generally meets these harvest, post-harvest ag water requirements, so it's a very low risk water source and it meets this quality, then it is exempt from performing this agricultural water assessment. The second is if you're using municipal water. So the actual requirement in the rule is if it's received from a public water system or supplied with documentation, then it would be exempt from this agricultural water assessment. And then the third exemption is if it's treated in accordance with the FSMA PSR. So if you are treating your water, and we have more on that a little bit later, if you're treating your water in accordance with the produce safety rule requirements, then it can also be exempt from this agricultural water assessment. The other requirement in order to obtain one of these exemptions is that it's reasonably likely the water quality is not going to change before a use. And each of these exemptions does require a very specific record. So this first one would require your testing results. You have to demonstrate and prove that that water source is testing at no detectable generic E. coli. Or if you're using municipal water, you would have to demonstrate with receipts or your municipal water testing. They often send out an annual report. And if you're treating, you would have to demonstrate through your treatment process record. And we do have templates for each of those records in the required records fact sheet. Okay, so just a quick example I wanted to share with you. Navigating exemptions. So in this scenario, this farm is using well water for overhead irrigation. This well is tested and meets the quality requirement. So we get their water test and it comes back as no detectable generic E. coli in a 100 ml sample. Is an agricultural water assessment required? Yes or no? Yeah. I see a couple of responses coming in. So correct. No. Because this water has no detectable generic E. coli, this ag water assessment is not required. I have one more quick scenario before we move on. This is an onion farm using drip irrigation. The water is untreated surface water. Is an agricultural water assessment required? Yes, fantastic. Yes, so because it's untreated surface water, that's a higher risk, so we cannot access one of those exemptions. Onions are a covered crop, growing is a covered activity, and this water is going to contact the harvestable portion, so it is considered agricultural water. Exactly. Okay, so we talked through some of the elements in this agricultural water assessment. Now, what are we going to do with that information? So the revised requirements in Subpart E require that growers first do the agricultural water assessment, and then you're going to use that information to make a determination. So you're going to essentially assess how risky is my water? Do I have to take a follow-up action? So there's a color-coded, essentially flow chart that they've developed. In red, you might suspect is going to be higher risk or highest risk. So if you do your agricultural water assessment and you determine that that water is not safe or of adequate sanitary quality, then you have to immediately stop using that water and take corrective measures. I'm going to talk through this flow chart, and then we're going to go through what those corrective measures are. But essentially, if your water meets this not safe and of adequate sanitary quality, you have to stop using it, and you can either treat your water or fix the issue and reinspect and confirm that that water is has been fixed. So I wanted to share a couple of examples of what is not safe and adequate sanitary quality. I always like to think of this as the ick factor. So if a water system or a water source, you look at it and you're like, something's wrong. There's raw sewage in my water. That would be not safe and of adequate sanitary quality. And these are a couple of very specific examples that FDA has provided. So raw sewage, we've seen this before with broken systems. It could be there are some very rural areas in the country where sewage is sort of, it kind of just is allowed to run off, especially in smaller areas. So raw sewage, this could also be from flooding if we get a large amount of flooding and it overtakes our sewage systems. A significant amount of animal waste is introduced. So this could be like an overflowing manure lagoon. We get a lot of rain, would be an example of that. And then the last one is dead and decaying animals in an ag water system. This could be something falls into your well, or this could be sheep in a canal system. There's a number of examples, but those are some examples. If you perform your ag water assessment, and those would be specific that water is not safe and of adequate sanitary quality. And then there's FDA continues with this kind of risk-based system. So continuing to go down from highest risk to lowest risk. If you find any conditions or on adjacent or nearby land. So this is not on your land. This is nearby. This could be a CAFO nearby, or this could be some kind of other animal production. So adjacent and nearby land poses risk related to animal activity, biological soil amendments of animal origin. This could be manure or compost or human waste. Then you would be required to implement mitigation measures promptly, no later than the same growing season. And then continuing with lower risk, other conditions that can introduce known or reasonably foreseeable hazards. I like to call these risks. These are not related to animal activity, soil amendments, or human waste. And then lastly is green is, I've done my agricultural water assessment. I've looked at my water source, my distribution system, and I really think that I don't see a lot of risk here. And then you can continue, keep chugging along, inspect and maintain water systems regularly and at least once a year. Okay, so the color coding in this slide corresponds with the color coding in the previous slide. So I'm going to flip back very quickly to show you corrective measures. This corresponds with that ick factor. That water, you've done your assessment, you've looked, and there's you're seeing something wrong with it. You have dead animals. I've worked with farms before, especially here on the East Coast, where sometimes one of the farms I've worked with they did a lot of hunting on their farm, and they had hunters come in, and they realized that the hunters were field dressing. They were gutting their deer very close to one of their irrigation ponds. And every time it rained, they realized they had a spike in E. coli counts when they took water tests. So that would be an example of not safe and of adequate sanitary quality. So what that farm did is they fixed the issue. They made sure that hunters were no longer using that area for field dressing. They took more water samples. They confirmed that the issue was fixed and resolved, and then they sort of moved on with their life. And they wrote all of that down. So again, not safe and of adequate sanitary quality would correspond with needing to take one of two corrective measures. What I want to point out here is the options are very, very limited. You only have two options if this is your situation. You can either reinspect the entire affected ag water system and fix it. Like that example I gave, they found the issue. They moved the contamination source, the dead deer. They retested, and that resolved. I've also worked with a farm that realized that they had sewage. There was a sewage pipe that was draining right into a creek that they were using downstream. They worked with the neighbor, got some plumbing installed, and they corrected the issue, re-inspected, and the issue was resolved. So re-inspecting and fixing it, or the second option is treating the water in accordance with standards in the produce safety rule. So what about any of the other issues in that flow chart? So if you realize your neighbor, there are risks from adjacent and nearby land use next door, or risks from human waste or soil amendments. This is where the mitigation measures come into play. And there are a number of different actions that you can take, including, again, fixing it, making repair, that's still an option. Increasing the time interval, so increasing the length of time between applying that water and harvesting the crop. And we know that generally pathogens do not survive very well in the environment. So if you apply them, they tend to die off over time. Increasing time interval between harvest and end of storage, treating the water, changing the water application method. You do have the option to look at your system and say, I used to, use overhead irrigation. I'm going to attempt to switch over to drip irrigation or maybe canals, something that's going to be lower risk and lower chance of that water contacting the crop. Okay, so I gave some examples of what these corrective or mitigation measures can look like. This first one is making repairs. And this option, this is sort of fixing your system, identifying that causal factor, making that repair and confirming that it was effective. This option will satisfy both the corrective measure and the mitigation measure. And I want to highlight for all of these, the key is documenting. So you have to record that the change was effective. The second option is treating the agricultural water. And again, this is both a corrective measure or mitigation measure. And I did try here to color code. So red is corrective issue. That's that not the water is not safe or adequate sanitary quality, sort of worst case scenario. Mitigation measures or anything else. Still risky, but probably not quite as concerning. And in treating water, there are a couple of options. There are not a lot of options available to us. There are chemical treatments. There are a couple of proxyacetic acid treatments that are available. I'm going to go into this in the next slide. Or non-chemical water treatment, something like a UV system. Those are better options they tend to be for smaller scale. So the requirement is that your treatment must reduce the potential for contamination of covered produce or food contact surfaces. And again, you would have to you're required to keep records of that. Oops. So I did want to highlight the next webinar, February 7th. I did not go into a lot of detail for treating pre-harvest agricultural water because I noticed that Dr. Chano Rock with the University of Arizona is going to be presenting the next webinar on February 17th. So if you were interested in this topic, and even if you're not interested in this topic, frankly, Dr. Rock gives really fantastic webinars, so I highly recommend. She's been doing a lot of work in this area, so definitely recommend that webinar. The other thing I want to mention is Produce Safety Alliance does have a sanitizer tool. We call it the EPA labeled sanitizer tool, and this was originally developed to help growers review and select sanitizers specifically on their labeled uses. Back when I first started with produce safety, we learned there were a lot of growers using like dollar store bottled bleach, other options that did not have an EPA label. And this is one of those using an EPA labeled product that's been tested in agricultural water systems is really important. So this tool is searchable. It does include a fact sheet and a tutorial, and you can find this resource in that resource link that I shared with you. And I will say there are a couple of relatively new chemical products that are labeled for treating human pathogens in pre-harvest agricultural water. So those would be suitable for treating your water per the FSMA produce safety rule. Okay, so the last mitigation measure that I wanted to highlight is this die-off provision. Like I mentioned, pathogens tend to die off over time. E. coli, Salmonella, none of these are very happy in the environment. Right, they survive very well in our guts. It's warm, it's dark, there's a lot of moisture and nutrients. Once you apply them, especially via water, you apply them out into the environment, they tend to die off because other organisms can outcompete them for food and nutrition. They also die off in the sun. So one of the ways that we can reduce risk is to maximize that amount of time between direct application and harvest. This die-off measure, for those of you who are following the rule requirements from back when it used to be a microbial water quality profile for testing pre-harvest water, this is one of those things that they have kept in here. So this is an option for a mitigation measure. Okay, so we're wrapping up this discussion of what the actual requirements are, and we're going to move into, I wanted to share with you a number of these resources that are available to help you meet these and comply with these requirements. So we've talked about the agricultural water assessment. I mentioned that the baseline requirement for this ag water assessment is that you have to do it every year. So you have to do a routine reassessment every year at the beginning of the growing season. And if you notice that there's a significant change, and this could be in any of those elements that I discussed, in the ag water system, like the water source or distribution system, say you're changing your practices, say you used to overhead irrigate or even just apply water for um, before harvest for increasing trigger pressure, crisping things up, whatever, and you've stopped that practice. Say you've switched to drip irrigation or canals or something else. Or if you changed cultivars, right? You're growing a different type of crop now. Or you've had flooding or some other change in environmental conditions. Essentially, anytime you have a significant change in your system, that's when you would be required to do a reassessment. And essentially that means conducting your agricultural water assessment again, incorporating what those changes were. So in terms of doing this assessment again, you would have to evaluate. So go through each of these factors and I'll show you the template. Look at each of these things, evaluate if there is increased hazards, lower hazards, lower risk, and then you also record this. So you would say, make this written determination. So that essentially says, I've looked at the system. I think I'm in that red or that orange or maybe that green area. I don't really see any risks. Then I can continue on with my life. But the key really is writing it down. And speaking of writing it down, that gets to record keeping. So in these revised requirements, there are a number of required records. So, and we broke this down in the slide based on category. So any farm that uses pre-harvest agricultural water, you are required to have your water systems inspection. That's that first requirement I talked about. And then agricultural water assessment. So that's two different pieces of record keeping. The agricultural water systems inspection and the agricultural water assessment. And then for farms that are testing your pre-harvest water as part of the ag water assessment, you would have to include those water test results. So again, you send it out to the lab, you receive your results, keep that in with your records. If you, for some reason, decide you don't want to test E. coli and you want to test something else, you can keep publications or records about why you've decided to test an organism other than E. coli. So essentially any other documentation that sort of falls into this category. And then I also wanted to highlight this slide is really about farms that are trying to access one of those exemptions. So if you are testing your water and it's no detectable generic E. coli, then you would keep those records. If you have municipal water, you would keep those records. And then lastly, if you have to take any corrective or mitigation measures, right? If you have to treat your water, if you decide to treat your water or fix your water system, you would keep those records as well. Okay. So the question is, if the grower uses a well and tests for E. coli and comes out not detectable, they are exempt for the water assessment, but not the inspection. Excellent. Yeah. So Alexandra, you were spot on. So I'm going to read that one more time. If the grower uses a well and tests for E. coli and that E. coli test is no detectable generic E. coli, comes out as no detectable, they cannot find E. coli in that water sample. And as long as that water source is not a surface water source, the idea here is that surface water sources are open to the environment, higher risk for contamination. So they do not meet that exemption. But yeah, so sorry, what was I? Yeah, so but spot on, they are exempt from the ag water assessment, but not the inspection. Okay. So fantastic. Keep asking questions if you have them. Now I wanted to highlight some of these resources. There is a QR code on this slide. Let me close my door really quick. Okay, it's about daycare pickup time. So there are a number of resources that I'm going to highlight. This one, if I'm going to pick one, I would selfishly pick the PSA required records fact sheet. So this is a fact sheet that you can use this QR code and it will pull up the direct link. I can also, let's see if this works. I can also try to drop, I will drop the exact link in the chat box. So this does work. There you go. So the first resource that I listed is a PDF. This is a fact sheet that lists all required records in the FSMA produce safety rule, not just pre-harvest ag water. The second is a template. So these download as a Word document, but they're editable. So you can change them, you can write in your entries. But we have updated this in the past year to update the agricultural water systems inspection and also add in template agricultural water assessment records. So I'll show you what those look like in the next couple of slides. I really like using the fact sheet because in addition to just the templates where you can fill in your information, It gives the baseline requirements of the rule, and we also give some suggestions. So, for example, if your farm is purchasing compost from a business or from a commercial composter, we have an example of a fact sheet that you can provide to that composter and say, I need this information from you. So it's both for farm created records, but also some of those other industries to sort of support that compliance. Okay, so as promised, I wanted to walk through specifically the agricultural water assessment template and highlight where you can put this information for each of the elements that we've gone through and discussed. So looking here, we have agricultural water system. So again, that's going to be the type of water source. Is it a well? Is it reused water? Is it municipal water? Is it a canal? How you're distributing it, how protected it is. And each of these templates has an example. So you're seeing a screenshot of the PDF that I shared. And this is an example. So we sort of wrote this out with a scenario in mind. And then the Word documents that I shared with you, that second link, those are blank. So obviously you need space to write your own water systems in. But hopefully sort of the way we've filled this out gives an example of the type of detail that you might want to consider for your own operation. We also include, again, the remaining elements. How are you using water? What are your crop characteristics, environmental conditions? And I want to highlight this written determination because when I'm going through and trying to understand the new requirements, this is where I always get hung up on. Like I can assess my water system. I can assess the water source, all of that. Where I struggle with is making this determination. So is it not safe or not safe or adequate sanitary quality? One or more off-farm uses related to animal activity. So essentially the way we did it is we have a little box so you can look at your risk and then make that checkbox. And each of these checkboxes aligns with one of those rows in that flow chart I showed you. So again, it helps you really think through, here's my risk. It helps you defend that risk. And I think that's as important as assessing risk, is saying, here's why I've made the decisions that I have. And I think that's especially important when you are doing when you're having a produce safety rule inspection, so that you can talk to the inspector and say, here's my assessment, in again, here's why I made the choices that I did. And then the last part of this template has space for, if you've determined that your pre-harvest agricultural water needs a corrective measure or a mitigation measure, there's space for that in that template as well. So a couple of final resources I wanted to share with you before I wrap up. In terms of Produce Safety Alliance resources, we have updated a fact sheet. So determining if you need to complete an agricultural water assessment. You can see that's a screenshot. This essentially helps you walk through those exemptions I shared, those three exemptions. If you have like a well water, or hopefully water that is testing with no detectable generic E. coli, municipal water, or treating, it sort of helps you walk through that to determine if you need to complete an ag water assessment. We also have a fact sheet that talks through the differences between the systems inspection and the ag water assessment, just has more detail about the requirements. And if anybody more is listening to this after the recording, we do have an on-demand video recording in English and Spanish, and it's set up in Qualtrics so that viewers can put in their information and receive a certificate sort of after the fact. For those of you who are listening here, you will qualify for a certificate, so that doesn't really apply to you. A couple of FDA resources I really want to highlight. They have resources with quite a bit of detail The newer one I wanted to highlight are frequently asked questions about revised pre-harvest ag water requirements. So as a trainer, especially, or somebody working with growers and sort of helping support growers, I find the examples in detail to be very helpful. If anybody is listening who has really read through the preamble, like that front material to Subpart E, I find this less helpful because you're probably already familiar with a lot of the examples, but I think they've sort of just distilled this out. They've categorized everything. So for example, under environmental conditions, they have a number of examples that what they would deem significant environmental conditions. So I think that's pretty helpful just for examples. But I want to highlight that currently there's no FDA guidance on how to comply with requirements. So what I've tried to share for you today are what are the requirements, where are resources and templates to help comply with them, um, but in terms of what to expect during inspections, and things like that, there's no additional FDA guidance yet. We're still sort of waiting on it. And I want to point that out because unlike water test results, this newer system of using an agricultural water assessment is, in my opinion, pretty subjective, right? I think we could show each of us, 17 people on this call, we could walk out to the same water source, the same system, and I expect a lot of us would fill out that template a little bit differently, because it is pretty, I think assessing risk is pretty subjective in and of itself. So since we don't have FDA guidance, I do want to highlight a recently updated guidance document. This is the International Fresh Produce Association, or IFPA, pre-harvest agricultural water industry guidance. I will put this chat box. This is actually pretty new, so I will put this in the chat box because this is not on that PSA list I already shared with you. And PSA helped put this together. We were on the sort of the working committee for this. And the thing I really like about it is it's a long document. I think it's like 71 pages, but the table of contents is very helpful. So I like that it includes a number of scenarios and even more helpful, like one-page issue briefs. Like if you want more information on environmental conditions, so that's where I tend to pull this up and sort of say, okay, what do other people think about this specific guidance? And it has a number of research publications as well that it lists. There we go. Okay. So with that, that kind of finishes up the slides. I have one more slide of the PSA website, but what I would like you to do is, for those of you who have sat in, everybody sat in on the whole session, if you would like to receive a Produce Safety Alliance certificate of completion for this essentially revised update webinar, you can click on the QR code. I can also put the link in the chat box for people that prefer working on their computers. So essentially, it asks a couple of questions, your name, a couple of other questions. And if you have your PSA grower training ID number, you can fill that out. I do not know mine. I do not expect people to know theirs. I will just make that clear. But if you do fill it, we can sort of link your certificate with your old I've attended a PSA grower training course certificate. And this is really just to help because I know people appreciate certificates, especially when working with like third-party audits and things like that. So you will receive a certificate. If you're interested, this is totally optional, in about a week or so. And for anybody who's listening to the recording, we are going to close down the QR code probably at the end of this week. But I previously shared with you the pre-recorded version. So if you want a certificate, you can find it there. So with that, I'm going to share the PSA website. My contact information is there at the bottom. There's my email address. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. And I also listed a lot of our social media accounts. We have a fantastic social media coordinator who kind of keeps us up. And every time we release new resources, things like that, we do try to post on social media. So with that, I'm going to see if anybody has any more questions.
I did not see any more